Today is Monday, March 14th. The year is 2022. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. All right, so welcome everybody to another episode of No Easy Answers, a Marxist podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. I have with me today Wahid Azal, I believe, if that's how I'm pronouncing it, all right? And and so I came across your article in Counterpunch, and I read that through, and I really wanted to get a chance to speak to someone and kind of have an organic conversation about what it's like to sort of learn about Aleksandr Dugin and kind of how unsettling that is, what the implications are, and how I think that it's not safe to ignore this stuff anymore. So maybe I'll start with just a general question here, like how did and when did you learn of Aleksandr Dugin? And what was that initial experience like? What did it trigger in you, and how do we find ourselves here today?
Okay, I'll start with Bismillah. I learned about Aleksandr Dugin roughly around the zeros. And at the time, when I first learned about Dugin, I mean, he was basically kind of the chief linchpin of the Russian far right. But then as we started moving into the Arab Spring, and as RT, both the Russian version of it and also the RT America started gaining ground, the talking points that was coming out of this network were extremely left-wing. And once we got into the period of Occupy Wall Street, I mean, it was basically RT that put Occupy Wall Street on the global map. Otherwise, the mainstream media, the corporate media of the West would have completely ignored that event. And this kind of pulled in a lot of people like myself, with left-wing leanings, and Marxist. I mean, I'm an eco-Marxist. I'm not what you might call a orthodox Marxist.
Okay, gotcha.
And I was hooked. And Dugin, during that time, himself was spouting an extremely left-wing language, with also then couched in the context of validating spirituality. And someone of my temperament, an Iranian, a Shia, a Sufi, gravitates towards these sorts of talking points that combines the left with, a kind of alternative or grassroots kind of spirituality, especially a earth-based spirituality, which I follow. And so I started getting close to these circles myself online, especially on Facebook. And when I was in Berlin, when I moved there in early 2012, together with my late wife, we started seeking these people out because we found the local left in Germany just completely fractured. Everybody was at each other's necks, lots of infighting between groups and that sort of thing. And, we were witnessing what was unfolding as a result of the Arab Spring as being extremely alarming. And these Russian hacks and their minions, especially in Germany, were quite active, particularly in the form of one particular individual by the name of Manuel Oxenreider, who died last year. And this individual was kind of Dugin's de facto representative in Germany. And it later turns out that this guy is just a neo-Strasserist on steroids. But at the time, the way that they were presenting themselves and how Oxenreider himself was presenting himself was, very amenable to the kind of worldviews that I have and my late wife had. And our friends in general, even including people like my dear friend Eric Dreytzner, who at the time was also appearing on RT and Press TV, etc. But the relationship went very sour quickly as the refugee issue started hitting Europe, and you had these influx of Syrian refugees coming through Syria and Turkey into Europe, and all of a sudden, and this coincided with exactly the same time. As the Ukrainian debacle Euromaidan unfolded and, the seizure of Crimea and invasion of Crimea by Putin. And all of a sudden, overnight, these circles, and particularly RT, changed their tune 180 degrees from a lefty kind of platform to a rabidly rancid far-right, white nationalist talking point. And that's when our relationship with these people in Berlin went very sour because my wife, God rest her soul, she came from a communist family. Her mother was a lifelong member of the KPD of Germany, while simultaneously being a practicing witch. So, my background and her background was just completely at opposite. I mean, ideological backgrounds were completely opposite what these people were presenting themselves in. We broke with them publicly. And then from around, early 2015 onwards, we were relentlessly being attacked by these people online, trolled, doxxed, you name it. The police file that we have in Berlin, based on the death threats and complaints that we were getting from these people, is massive. Suffice it to say that in early 2016, I penned that article that you just mentioned, Dugin's Occult Fascism and the Hijacking of Left Anti-Imperialism, Muslim Anti-Salafism, because we were finding that the entire anti-imperialist Syria issue was being completely hijacked by these people, where they were essentially engaging in the same kind of tactics that we probably saw in the 20s in Germany, where elements of the left were being recruited into the far right. So they were browning the red, as it were, which is a historical, a very long-standing historical tactic of fascists and National Socialists, white nationalists of every stripe. And friends and comrades of ours, who we never expected, would fall for this snake oil, fell for it. And I kind of, not of my own choosing, but I sort of emerged as sort of a voice amongst people from my part of the world, from the Middle East, etc., who were both standing against empire as well as white nationalists. I kind of became their voice, but then the attacks would escalate, and all of these attacks eventually led to the very mysterious passing of my wife on March 11th, 12th of 2019 in Berlin, exactly 3 years from today. A case that is still being investigated by German federal police. It appears that the trail has gone cold, but there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that my wife and possibly myself were being targeted in that capacity by these various groups. We were also active on our street. We became basically the de facto Antifa on our street at the time, pushing against the rising tide of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. This is the white nationalist far-right party that won 90 seats in the German Bundestag as of the election of 2017. So we were quite active during that period, and all of this led to the tragic passing of my wife, which, who's, what actually happened still remains to be, uncovered by the police. Whether we will ever get to the truth or not, I don't know. But what should alarm a lot of people is that the reason why the German feds took the case is it appears that there were insiders working in the office of the district attorney of Berlin itself, the Staatsanwaltschaft, that basically stymied and did some very bizarre things during the handling of this case, beginning with the autopsy, actually beginning with when my wife was taken to the ER of the Charité hospital in Berlin. And I made this complaint to them as a result of this. And then they advised that I should leave Germany because I was being targeted. And given the history in Germany with the NSU murders, the National Socialist Underground, who were targeting, all kinds of people, and there was a case still pending in Munich at the time, they advised that I leave with my young daughter and come to Australia, where my mom resides. And so we did that, and here we are. But I'm looking back at this period, at least the last decade, and most of the predictions that I had made in that article briefly, unfortunately, have come true, even exceeding my worst expectation. I have a little bit more of a nuanced view of all of this now, not a nuanced view in terms of trying to validate or vindicate the Duginists. But where the nuance comes is that I believe that this is not merely a situation where you have a figure such as Dugin and these various forces of his, these Eurasianist forces and white nationalists being completely puppeteered by Russia. There are a myriad of actors within the West itself, and people with lots of money behind them. Steve Bannon comes to mind, but also the Mercer family, who effectively have been pulling Steve Bannon's strings throughout. And these people, in essence, have gravitated towards Dugin and have formed a sort of whether a de facto or official alliance with Dugin or his entire ideology, wanting essentially to turn back the clock, to about 50 years ago. What Dugin represents himself as sort of the Rasputin of Putin, as it were, and what Putin himself is now doing, whether through the war in Ukraine or generally in the last 10 years leading up to it, has been to basically galvanize segments of the right in the West as a whole towards the Russian orbit. And this is a situation that is quite dangerous, and I don't believe that the liberals, whether in America or on the continent, are really prepared or equipped or really understand what is going on. Because there is a Trojan horse, a very powerful Trojan horse within these societies or operating within the institutions of all liberal democracies within the United States or in Europe itself. We saw that with the presidency of Donald Trump. But this story continues, and these people are still there. It's not just Donald Trump.
Wow. I just want to say that I'm so sorry that this has happened to you and your wife, and 3 years from the day. I didn't expect us to be having this conference on 3 years from the day, but I hope that through this podcast episode and you telling your story and us examining this and probing into it and talking through it, I hope that this can travel out to be able to make more people aware of your late wife and the events and things that have gone through stuff. So that's part of the overall mission of doing this. So, you said quite a bit there. And I want to get to talking about the Mercer family and Dugin linking that you just spoke of. And I do want to get to the Syria Browning the Red thing that you mentioned. And I do want to talk about who Oxenreider is, the name that you mentioned.
I know Aleksandr.
Right. And I do want to speak about the public break that you had with these folks as well. But I think the first thing that comes up for me in just hearing all this from you was that you are a person that has a spiritual side to you.
Yes.
Maybe it is the fact that I am, I think what I'm putting together out of this is that you and your wife were looking for a community that was a leftist community that was spiritual and had maybe an ecological sort of side to it as well. But I think but you were looking for that within an incredibly hostile environment towards Muslims or people from the Middle East at that point.
Yep.
And so in searching for this sort of blend of spiritual and naturalist outlooks and egalitarian politics, the stuff that was coming out of Aleksandr Dugin and some of the people that follow his stuff was appealing to you at that time. And I wonder if you might speak to that a bit.
Yes, because they were also very careful in camouflaging their real beliefs and the things that they had written and said. I didn't actually get to read his Fourth Political Theory until probably around the end of 2014 because it was just not available, in a decent English translation. There was several translations of it floating around. When I finally got this and I sat down and carefully read it cover to cover, I was just absolutely blown away at how incredibly dangerous and how many fallacies exist in this book and how it is appealing to a paradigm that I don't think any person of color in their right mind can possibly subscribe to. Because it is, in so many words, I mean, he goes through great lengths to dissimulate a lot of things. But when you look at his sources, I mean, the entirety of the sources that Aleksandr Dugin marshals in the Fourth Political Theory are far-right and new-right sources, from Alain de Benoit, who is practically his guru, and Nouvelle Droite, and various figures from the third position, and these are all neo-Nazis. And to try to build a political theory on the back of some stuff like this leads to only one place. Now, Dugin is very careful, and you probably saw that in that last video of his that I sent you the other day. He's very careful to kind of dismiss himself as being a racist. But this is all dissimulation. because where Dugin's political theory leads, the fourth political theory leads, is to this idea of multi-polarism, which is ethno-pluralism. And what that means is a very, a somewhat sophisticated way of saying, white people in white countries and dark people and black people in their own countries, where, strict borders are enforced, etc. Now, while these people rail against, the neoliberal globalist order, as I do as well, if you're a Marxist of any description, you are an internationalist. So, the very concept of borders and people, staying in their own countries is anathema, not to mention that the science, is pretty hard and unequivocal in the fact that the very concept of race is a fallacy. But these people, through various, tricks, intellectual tricks and whatnot, are basically pushing a identical agenda to the kind of nonsense that we saw in the 1930s in Germany. Whereas they may not come out overtly like the Alfred Rosenbergs and the Nazi theorists of that period, the implications of what they are saying effectively amounts to the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not happy or delighted to hear you describe that, but it gives me some form of comfort to know that your analysis on that is very in alignment with mine. In terms of the multipolarity, I thought the other day that I don't think people understand how much work the word multipolarity is doing to posit Russia as a powerful country.
Yeah.
Like the entire argument and discourse as a whole, as it pertains to multipolarity, is something that is I've felt is could be wholly a Russian propaganda theme or a Russian stimulated discourse of some sense. But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right in that the sort of pluralism that's preached by Aleksandr Dugin and the way that he is very careful to discard, accusations of racism. The entire concept of plurality to him is a very, like, almost just a beautified way of, like, what better way to I don't know, to beautify the particular, to dismiss universality than to beautify the particular, or to have a very dressed up way of saying blood and soil.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there is this like coded language part of it as well that, and I think that there are various, like, people arrive at leftist positions through various avenues of political awakening, and and I think that, like, you can get there via anti-capitalism, but that particular road is you're beset on both sides of you by people who want to pull you towards egalitarian politics and other people that want to pull you towards fascism. So it's interesting that you say that, like, this came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, because I think that was the first time I had ever seen in my lifetime like a public display of, like, a consensus that we are dissatisfied with capitalism, or that we are wanting to go after it was ripe for, like, a populist leader at that point, like it could have been taken over. So I wonder, now that we've gone through all that, and you went to Berlin, and that's where you met this fellow Oxenreider. Can you tell me about him? Emmanuel Oxenreider. Okay.
Emmanuel Oxenreider is a bit of an enigmatic character. He was the editor-in-chief of a magazine that basically is catering towards the military crowd, known as Zuerst in German. I think it means awakening or something like that in German. We invited him and his Armenian Syrian girlfriend to our house a few times in 2014. And the one thing that my wife asked him after she kind of, did a little bit of background search is, what is all of this about Zuerst? And his confession to her was that, we're basically, having to pull certain left-wing people right and right-wing people left, for the greater cause of eventually toppling the neoliberal capitalist world order. And he was very careful to couch his explanation in very left-wing terms in the way that she could understand it. But, all her flags went up because my wife was German. And, in Germany, there is a thing called brown esoteric or brown esotericism, or even, the browning of the red, that was very prevalent in Germany during the Second World, before the Second World War, and especially in places like Munich, even into, you would say, the 1970s and 1980s, where her mom was quite active. So, left-wing Germans, authentic Marxist Germans, have always had their flags up about these sorts of developments, because this is the sort of development that led directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933. And all her flags went up. So, I began to read more and investigate these people more. But they themselves let the gauntlet down with, first, supporting this, very racist rhetoric about the influx of refugees coming out of Syria. And on these examples went. Well, and also, basically supporting the rise of Pegida. This was the refugee, anti-immigrant, white nationalist movement that rose in Dresden in 2014, and just basically gripped the German imagination, especially in the East. And at the time, in 2014, all of a sudden we saw the Duginists all jump on the Pegida bandwagon. And there's all these Muslims, Shia Muslims, otherwise many of them supporters of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, who, they're all caught in the middle. It's like, well, how as a Muslim do you justify what these Russian fascists and their minions in the United States are saying? And so these people were basically then now pushing the line that these refugees were all terrorists. So basically pushing the line of RT and the most, rancid far-right, neo-Nazi rhetoric that was coming out of other portals throughout the continent. And this was extremely disheartening. So, and then we also saw Assad and the Assad regime itself adopt this rhetoric, especially when Putin and the Russians came in to help them as of 2015. And for the life of me, it's like, well, this even as a strategy, as a temporary political strategy, this is bound to fail and create unnecessary divisions and rift even within, emigre Muslim communities. On the one hand, we're being, pushed by these, radicalized Sunni jihadists. On the other hand, then we have these Russians, basically trying to push a racist narrative on us at the same time, And this is where we found ourselves in 2015, particularly when, Germany, Merkel finally opened the doors of Germany and let, I think, about less than 1 million of these refugees to come into Germany, which an effort we actually were involved in helping a lot of these people to relocate and settle themselves, etc. And we were, basically put a target on our back as a result of all this, whether with the Russian forces themselves online and elsewhere, or with the German right, with the AfD and their minions who are effectively puppets of Moscow, as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. So that's really, I'm sorry you've gone through so much with with radical Islam kind of pushing you on one side, and then you have these erroneous Russian racists trying to push you into this very flowery version of Blood and Soil. And that's, I don't know. I never even thought to consider any of the sort of the social climate around Occupy Wall Street as it would affect someone of someone who is spiritually inclined, who is ethnically from the Middle East, that's experiencing this sort of prejudice that's happening in those moments. That's really terrible. You eventually had a public break with these folks. I'm very interested in the way that you had mentioned that there is already a red flag that goes up for people who are familiar with this sort of thing, and then you yourself having to go through this process of studying up in order to get to a place where you can have a public break with that, right? Yeah. So would you tell us about what you studied in order to get to the point where you could come to a public break, and then what was that public break like?
Well, reading the Fourth Political Theory itself cover to cover very carefully. That was the first place, and that occurred in 2014. But like I mentioned, the clincher was with these people coming out in support of Pegida.
Right.
Because this was just not on. Here we were, basically part of several different anti-racism groups in Berlin, trying to push back against the mainstream German media, who itself was, adopting slight xenophobic and jingoistic talking points. And then for these people who we thought, were basically, trying to push back against these sorts of things that are part of the entire package of the neoliberal world order, as I call it, jumping on its bandwagon itself. That was it. That was just like, that is absolutely not on. Friendship or no friendship, whatever. This is fascism, pure and simple.
Yeah.
But by reading his fourth political theory and just realizing that this guy is just dissimulating, but even in his dissimulation, it is so transparent, the program that he's putting forward, that you cannot deny it, that what these people are doing is exactly the same strategies that the Nazis themselves adopted in the 20s and early 30s with the left in Germany. So as a result of this in 2016, several people asked me to put together something, for Counterpunch, just summarizing all of these issues. And the result is the article that you read.
So the public break was the article itself.
Well, it had already occurred, but this was the seal. Yeah. This was
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. So when you talk about the Syria situation and how Dugin's people sort of, I guess, muddied the water around that or overtook this thing, and you called it browning the red.
Yeah.
Was that by any chance the New Horizon convention that you're speaking to?
That's a part of it. That's the conference that the Iranians hold once a year. And they invite all of these various figures from Europe and elsewhere who are all pretty much, white nationalists and far rightists. But no, this was more concerted effort. This was on the social media level, where as the war began to expand in 2011, all of the circles online, whether on Facebook, Twitter, etc., just got inundated with people with very weird agendas. On the one hand, they would come in and spout a very clear anti-imperialist position, but on the other hand, then platforms associated, like for example, the Syrian Social National Party, which is an ally of the Baathists of Syria, who are effectively Syrian National Socialists. These people would come in. There's that one woman who lives here in Australia as well, Mimi Allaham, the Syria girl, the famous Syria girl. She became kind of the face of all of that. Her whole family are involved, according to her, with the Syrian National Party, the SNP. And then we start to see, very close confluence and alliances between these people and, groups, based out of Belgium and etc. These are like, identitarian white nationalists and whatnot, who are also spouting the anti-imperialist line, but then simultaneously spouting anti-immigration lines, very racialized, on every level, brushing everybody with the same stroke, claiming to want to purify Europe of immigration and immigrants and all these brown people have come in, quote unquote, infested the continent, etc. And, these sorts of contradictions, to someone, who can actually reason their way through things are obvious. But in a situation where you have a war as devastating as the one in Syria was, and as, convoluted as the one in Syria became, it is easy for even the natives and the locals to be pulled into this stuff. And this is what happened. Now, the Syrian regime, the Ba'athist Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad is a uber Arab nationalist regime whose rhetoric, Ba'athist rhetoric in general, is very, problematic, even though they're Arabs. But this SNP, which is an ally of theirs, is overtly a National Socialist party. It's an Arab National Socialist group.
Wow.
And they've been around since the 1930s and 40s. So this stuff was very, very troubling. And then you see the same sorts of development happening amongst supporters of Hezbollah and the resistance actions in Lebanon, and not so much from the mouth of its leadership, but more from its rank and file and prominent leadership. So, for example, one of the very dominant and prominent Duginists in Lebanon is this woman, Marwa Osman, who I've locked horns with numerous times on and offline. And she comes from a very prominent Hezbollah family. She's been, showcased at this very conference in Iran that you mentioned. She's come in and out of the offices of Hassan Nasrallah and taken to Iran to meet with the supreme leader over there. etc. And she rubs shoulders with some of these very rancid Nazis, whether European versions of them or Russians. And every time I have tried to point this out to people that, this just doesn't make any sense, for Muslims, and especially Muslims who are coming from that stream of resistance ideology in Lebanon, it does not make any sense for these people to be allying with these Russians, who are just wedge pushing amongst groups. That this is a very classic 19th century divide and conquer tactic that they're employing against these groups who are trying to advocate for peace, for the end of war, for the retreat of these, proxy forces that are operating in Syria and throughout the Middle East, whether ISIS or otherwise. But once all of this was basically hijacked on the social media level and also on the media level to some degree via the Russian alt media ecology that is all over YouTube and all over the internet, things got quite heated and more heated until we lead up to the election of Donald Trump.
Man, this last 6 years or so, I think as a person on the left, I know that while there was speculation about Russian interference in the election, it was something that you ran the risk of being called like a Russophobe or being told that you're a liberal or something because it's been this way since the Cold War, and it's you're just reading too much into it, and this is the Democrats are doing this so they can win. But I think I would hope that and I know for me personally that when Russia invaded Ukraine recently, it changed how it changed how I felt about one, is Dugin relevant and is he safe to ignore? But two, it made me take this sort of 10,000-foot view above it all, and think that maybe we need to go back and reopen the question. Those Marxists that dismiss that stuff, of this was probably happening, and two, the United States is not the only country capable of propaganda.
Yeah, sure.
And it seems like kind of a Western chauvinist or a sort of Western privilege to even not consider that there is another country capable of propaganda.
Well, all power is capable of propaganda. Those who have power are afraid to lose it, and they will use any means to keep themselves there. And that's true of Russia as it is true of the United States and of Europe and any other power for that matter. And this is the problem with the nature of power and authoritarianism in the modern age. And it won't change whether Putin stays or goes or they lose or win, whatever. I am no friend to NATO. I am no friend to the Atlantic West. I think they are a big part of the problem. I look at NATO as a criminal organization that has proven itself that time and again. Marxists need to be a little bit more wise, and jumping either on the bandwagon of Russiagate or otherwise kind of misses the forest for the trees. The Russians had help in getting their man into the White House on the ground through the Republican Party. I mean, you need to look at the massive amount of purges in state legislatures controlled by the Republican Party that was happening in the lead up to that election. And also because the liberals and under the Obama administration essentially failed in many of their promises, economic promises primarily. And America wasn't better off 8 years from the election of Barack Obama than it was when Mr. Trump got elected. And, Trump was a snake oil salesman, so was Obama. So I find it problematic, at least in the West, that many on the left align themselves in these issues with the liberal center, because the liberal center is the ruling class, essentially. And, if we truly believe in class war, then fundamentally the axiom is that the ruling classes of these societies themselves are a problem. So my point of view today is that we need to take a middle path and basically become an authentic left needs to emerge on this planet that basically takes on both of these two, the Atlantic powers that be and these Eurasianist wannabe fascists at the same time, because we cannot afford either of these two powers to continue in business as usual, because our planet ecologically is on the verge of a general system failure. And this is the science is tight on this, that if we're not careful, we're looking at the barrel of a extinction event, very shortly.
Yeah.
Within either in our lifetime or shortly thereafter. And both of these powers are perpetrators, whether we're talking about the Atlantic West, the United States and its allies, NATO, etc., or China, Russia, and etc. And so we, in essence, we need to go back to the drawing board, back to the original sources, but also then look at these original sources through the lenses of contemporary theorizing and also events to lead us to proper strategies of confronting both of these at the same time, rather than being pulled by one into the other. Because this has been precisely the problem and why there has been such readiness among certain segments of the left in the West to get pulled into the Duginist camp or the fascist camp, is because the disunity that exists amongst the left everywhere, where you have one group of people, basically drumming for one cause, another for another cause. Trade unionism is dead. The issue of class struggle is no longer even spoken about in many left-wing circles. Proper analysis of economic trends are not looked upon. And even, more importantly than that, on the level of language. I mean, if since Heidegger is so important to Mr. Dugin, and, Heidegger says somewhere, language is the house of being. One of the things that a lot of people on the left have been doing over the last 10 years is like appropriating terminology that is coming from these fascists. One notable one is the term geopolitics. Geopolitics is a completely fascist concept. It arises from the writings of this British, imperial era scholar Herbert Mackinder, where he basically divides the world into the land powers and the sea powers. And Aleksandr Dugin basically revived this character, Herbert Mackinder, and he actually mentions that in that video I sent you. Right. And basically lays out a vision of the world where basically the struggle is basically between the ruling classes of these, sea powers and earth-based powers, etc. And I look at that as just a complete load of nonsense, but at the same time, extremely dangerous paradigm and lens to look at the world. But this is what is unfolding, and this is the strategy that Dugin has developed, and particularly in that book of his, The Foundations of Geopolitics, which unfortunately has not had an English translator yet, where he lays out all of this stuff, and then he proposes certain strategies about how certain things can be manipulated, how Russia can find effective opportunities to undermine its various enemies, including, I might add, China, because in that book, Dugin looks on China as an enemy, that ultimately needs to be cut to size as well. So it's not as if that Russia and China are allies in this, in this eonic struggle against the West. Ultimately, Dugin's view, and then possibly that of the Russian ruling establishment, is to eventually then confront China itself.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of John J. Mearsheimer lately about this stuff, and it strikes me that the concept of geopolitics to Mearsheimer is really kind of identical to Dugin, or it's that geopolitics is nothing more than like a world stage where all the nations sit, and it's like a poker table where everybody is cheating, that it is anarchic and there are no rules, and so the actions and behaviors of nations, however sociopathic they may be, are ultimately sort of naturalized within this context. And, I don't know if that's just like realpolitik or something, I don't know if that is just...
That's realpolitik. That's the classic 19th century definition of realpolitik, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Because so I think about that, and I don't know how to get beyond that, but it strikes me as when you're talking about this middle path, dude, like this sort of carving out of like, hey, we don't have to be to be anti-Eurasianist is not pro-NATO, and we can argue with both sides and we can walk and chew gum.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the ultimate threat of the Duginist ideology is this sort of, it takes all the world and turns it into this sort of Manichaean, like us against them kind of thing.
Yeah.
It carves out, it's like that Heidegger quote where it's like, you have to create the enemy if the enemy doesn't exist in order to stand against the enemy. Yeah. So all that being said, man, like I've had conversations on this show before where I've thought like, the worldview, like the left does not have a worldview right now.
That's the
like
problem.
At least the American left
That's the problem.
is like in this, like our ultimate goals of any sort of like democratic socialism, or
Exactly.
I don't know. It's like free college, and we spend this money on ourselves on healthcare, and it's all this individualized self. I don't know, man. It's like we have problems as a whole collective unit, the left, imagining.
Yeah.
And maybe there's an argument to be made that like our imagination threshold is set by the economic conditions on the ground or something. But I just mean to say that like the left needs a better worldview.
Yes.
And we've had conversations about that at all. And I'm just like sitting here really refreshed by you saying that there needs to be like this middle ground between these Eurasian wannabe Nazis and NATO on the other side.
Yes.
Because if we don't have a sort of nuanced perspective on that, then we kind of turn the Manichaeanism on ourselves. It turns into black and white. It turns into a two-dimensional sort of a non-nuanced sort of position to take.
Yeah. I mean, the catch-call should be socialism or bust, but what kind of socialism do we want?
Sure.
Because, over the last several, decades, lots of information has been coming out from the notebooks of Marx that were never published, that Marx himself held a very deep ecological side. And there have been several scholars who've been looking at this, and his notebooks have started to be translated. And he has a concept of metabolism that kind of nuances everything that we understand by dialectical materialism itself. So I would invite people to look at that, look at, Marx's notion of metabolism, because then we can then very much more clearly elaborate what kind of a socialist society needs to emerge. What are we going to be fighting for? What does ecological sustainability mean? Because the Soviet model of socialism that went so awry, operated on the premise of productivism. So we can, exploit nature at will until we deplete ourselves, to oblivion. And then maybe if we have the science, we can replenish all of this. But that's not how it works. There is a metabolism between humanity and nature. And that's something that Marxists need to seriously take aboard, especially by going and reading and contemplating some of these late notebooks of Karl Marx himself. And this segues for someone like me into that kind of earth-based, nature-based kind of spirituality that I think is also very important for people to have as a sort of guide. If something is made sacred, then it is worth, in a sense, fighting for. And that sacrality can occur with with yourself, with your surroundings, with your environment, for future generations. How indigenous people, for example, or what sociology or anthropology calls primitive peoples, which I kind of don't like as a term, how they look at the world. How, for example, the shamanic worldviews of the Amazon, or even somewhere like Mexico, and you have the Zapatistas of Mexico who have actually appropriated this worldview. So their leftism is a leftism that is very autochthonous and is very indigenous in the way that it approaches. It's not, it's not brown, it is not nationalist, it is something else completely. And so these sorts of perspectives, I think, are extremely helpful. Where in the West, for example, you have many people gravitating towards neo-paganism, right? They don't necessarily have to just, be navel gazing and do rituals at home and, talk about the goddess and whatnot. They can take this into the streets and fight for Mother Earth, as it were, fight for the children of Mother Earth, their fellow comrades, etc. So all of these things can be, negotiated, intellectually into a coherent political program that is Marxist, but is Marxist for the 21st century and is ecologically focused. So we can actually do that. It's very possible. And the theories are out there, the writings are out there, and I think the will is beginning to emerge for us to be able to pull something like that off as well.
I could talk to you about this stuff for hours, man. And I love what you're saying here, because I think that you're getting to something that I brought up to Benjamin Teitelbaum. Benjamin Teitelbaum is the guy who wrote War for Eternity. We had him on the show, and it's through reading his work that I first encountered Aleksandr Dugin, and here we are today. But in that episode that I just released about Aleksandr Dugin, he was talking in these clips that I caught up, that I integrated into that show. One of the clips, he's talking about what he calls the national idea, and And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I was trying to piece all this stuff together, as you would imagine, coming into learning about Aleksandr Dugin and trying to couple that with your Marxism and your concepts of fascism and your ideology and the sort of confusing terrain that's always shifting underneath you. All that stuff in particular, it was confusing enough to where I realized that part of the reason why maybe something like January 6th could have happened, or why there was this weird like rise of Christian nationalism, or was because of a sort of secularism in society and like this gap where their spirituality used to occupy it.
Yes.
And so in not having it, or maybe in having a civic religion is one of the ways a society copes with that. Maybe society maybe you do stuff like you have burial rites for flags instead of the sacred or something, or the sacred is kind of transferred into mythological figures like a giant statue of Abraham Lincoln or something.
Oh, but it's sublimated into the state, so that becomes a statist religion.
Right. Yeah. You separate the church and the state, and the state just becomes a church. But like that aspect of this, like almost like a latent thirst for the spiritual that happened within our secular society, felt like a key component to why a space for this form of fascism would emerge. In the case of Dugin, a very sort of Evolian spiritual racist form of fascism. So I don't know, man. I mean, I felt the space here in this conversation to mention that, because I'm not a spiritual person, so I look and wonder and look to other people to provide a description of these things to me, because I don't know them myself, and I don't, it's like, in examining philosophy and trying to do a good job of that, and looking at some theology and things like that. I think Dugin recognizes that too, man.
Yes, he does.
Like there is,
but so did Marx. Marx recognized this as well. I mean, especially in the latter part of his Hegelian phase. That quote of his that is always taken out of context: "Religion is the opium of the masses," is not actually a negative statement. Once you read the whole section, and especially that entire quote in its entirety, he recognized this very much. And the concept of alienation that Marx presents anticipates precisely this development that we're seeing. Bourgeois society and its modes of production, the way that the capitalist society structures itself, lends itself, especially with the working classes and peasantry, etc., to alienation. Meaning is denuded of these societies. You are merely made into a cog in a wheel, and your value only exists in cash. So inevitably, that alienation occurs, and inevitably, that kind of a secular society lends itself to precisely these sorts of internal contradictions that then allow someone like an Aleksandr Dugin, or if Dugin didn't exist, they'd have to invent him, someone like him, to come along, a Pied Piper kind of figure, to lead the certain masses down the proverbial cliff. And this is what has happened. And the blame for that lays completely at the feet of nature, the neoliberal society that we've created, which is capitalism, and capitalism that Marx saw on steroids, and it's adopted features that I don't think even Marx or Engels could have even anticipated. One example of which I've mentioned many times, is that under neoliberalism we have witnessed a kind of an inverse or a reverse trend to what Marx predicted would happen under socialism. That is, under neoliberalism, the state has withered away, but it has withered away to what? It has withered away to the corporatocracy. So the state is now essentially a prop, a phantom to the powers of corporation and the corporate state. It kind of boggles my mind that there are not that many more Marxists out there who are not seeing this trend, or are not alarmed and coming to some kind of a formulation of strategy that is, multifaceted and is able to, address a myriad of different issues to tackle this proverbial beast. Because if we don't, these fascists will indeed win. And they are good at galvanizing the symbology of religion and spirituality to that end. And then, basically corrupting and then pulling people into these authoritarian modalities of thinking and discourse and whatnot. I break down the issue rather than as being a fight between secularism and religion. I look at the overall issue here as the conflict between authoritarianism and its opposite. That if we can resolve this issue, if we can resolve the proclivity of human organization and community from descending into authoritarian modes of governance, then the issue of religion and spirituality is completely tangential and is not necessarily tied to the historical experiences that we've had in how religions and religious institutions have behaved. And Marx himself also to some degree anticipates this and kind of alluded to this in several different places, and particularly in his Hegelian phase.
Well, if alienation is like, if alienation has gotten to such withering heights of like just depravity that that it's created this sort of this gap that something will fill it,
exactly.
man? Like it, and it's like it could be an act or not of your choosing sort of
exactly.
thing. Yeah. So yeah, all that is fascinating, man. And I'm glad that I was able. I mean, I've not been able to have a conversation on this topic with many people, and so I part of me is really fulfilled right now for even being able to do that.
Okay.
So yeah. So I don't know, man. Like at this point now, I mean, you had sent me a video of Aleksandr Dugin recently. I forget what date that was on. I think it was on like March 6th or 7th. But I wanted to say that like I've never seen I've watched a lot of videos of Aleksandr Dugin at this point, studying this guy, trying to figure him out, and I've never seen his body language seem so joyful or effusive, or like he in that speech he's basically like confirming a lot of our like the implications to Dugin seems like this is an epic sort of continental confrontation, that it's like the forces of light, which he seems to always, they always seem to think they're the force of light, right? Versus a sort of satanic and powerful, a satanic force in the West. Even though there are people who have described Aleksandr Dugin's practices as satanic. So
he is a Satanist. I mean, at the end of the day, he's a left-hand path Satanist. He comes from that occultist milieu that has figures like Aleister Crowley in there, although I'm a little bit ambivalent about Crowley myself. But one particular influence that I didn't know at the time when I wrote that article, but my friend Branko Malic, Croatian Catholic intellectual, kind of notified me to, was that the influence of this occult satanic left-hand path order known as the Order of the Nine Angles is very prominent in the kind of things that Aleksandr Dugin is doing. That the resonances between his kind of discourse and what they're trying to implement is just too uncanny to dismiss out of hand. Now, until that time, until some of the stuff that Branko was putting online in 2016 and 2017, even seasoned Dugin watchers like Anton Chekostov were aware of this angle themselves. So Branko basically shed the light on this and made that connection. And I have pretty much come to that conclusion myself, that, whereas, Crowley, maybe a clownish figure, kind of a guru of the LHP occult circles of the West, but, really it is ONA, the Order of the Nine Angles, and the people who founded that is the real influence on that. And you see, when you go back to Dugin's activities in just on the lead up to the fall of the Soviet Union and the decades subsequent to that, Dugin speaks Dugin speaks to this stuff. He was also involved in many of these occultist circles himself, and several of his comrades at the time in Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere. So what appears to me and to other Dugin watchers is that this whole talk of Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, is really a smokescreen, because a lot of Dugin's own points of departure would be considered by the Eastern Orthodox Church to be heresy in many respects. So he is presenting, or pushing a LHP Satanist kind of agenda, political agenda, while masquerading himself as an Eastern Orthodox Christian. I mean, I've pointed this out to several Russians on and offline, and they've seen it, and they find it very disturbing. But the Russian state and Putin particularly seems to value this perspective, and so this adds another layer to this, which should disconcert people.
Right, and I don't know enough about like mysticism or spirituality to find any sort of like. I mean, when someone says Aleister Crowley, I mean, I don't really know anything about the guy, So the accusations of satanic practice around this is just stuff that I've seen come from various people, but it's a bit hard to discern whether it's hyperbole, whether it's like, but it sounds like these are actual like, when you said it's chaos magic or something like that in your article, it's like these are new concepts to me as like an atheist who doesn't have any. I've never had to research this stuff. I mean,
well, I would advise you to look at this stuff, and I would probably start first by kind of getting you to read the works of my late friend Nicholas Goodrick Clark. He wrote this was part of his research. He wrote several books, but two of which he wrote. One was called The Occult Roots of Nazism, where he basically unpacks this whole Western occult subtext to the rise of National Socialism, particularly with the Theosophical Society and Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. All of that, because much of the National Socialist symbology comes out of the work of Blavatsky herself. ISIS unveiled and secret doctrine, etc. And Goodrick Clark, really delineates all of that. It gets really deep into the historical groups and trends that were operating in Europe in the latter part of the 19th century, leading up to the First World War and then thereafter. So this stuff is important because these things have political implications. I mean, I've said this to many of my friends on the left. You dismiss this stuff at your peril, right? Not so much in terms on the level of ideas, but on the level of action, of what these sorts of ideas potentially can unleash on a given society with the people that they recruit in their orbit. And just like the Theosophical Society spawned, essentially, whether accidentally or deliberately is an academic question at this point, just as it spawned National Socialism in Germany, one could argue that many of these ideas, and especially the ones that Dugin has been spouting, are responsible for the same sorts of trends that we saw in the 20s and the 1930s. And that's why I think lefties need to be especially discerning and especially vigilant and really understand these concepts. There's a lot of literature that has been coming out, especially over the last couple of years because of the election of Donald Trump. But all of them, basically first start off with the scholarship of my friend Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who really did a really fine historical job of laying all this stuff out.
That's amazing that you were his friend, because in the research for all this stuff, I ended up picking up that book about the Nazi occultism, and obviously I haven't read all the way through it, but I also have his book on Savitri Devi.
Yes. Yeah.
So like, and his book on Savitri Devi, it's interesting to meet a person like you that would be familiar with that, because there's this sort of like anti-human nihilism or misanthropy that came out of her that seems to have had current day effects still in ecological circles. But itself is not like, I read about her in my in trying to decipher Julius Evola. And I was trying to figure out the René Guénon stuff and the Evola stuff and Frithjof Swan and Aman Kumaraswamy. I can't pronounce his name correctly.
Ananda Kumaraswamy.
Yes. So all these figures came on my radar when I was reading this stuff. But that's so interesting that you knew Nicholas.
Yeah, he was a correspondent of mine. Until he passed away a couple of years ago.
I didn't even know that he had passed because I discovered that when I put his book down and was like, I have to try and email this guy to be on the show. And that's when I had discovered that he had passed. So it's interesting that you bring him up and that you were his friend, that you corresponded with him. I mean, so speaking of Savitri Devi, I mean, listeners might remember, I did speak a little bit about her in like episode 29. but she is responsible for something known as esoteric Hitlerism.
Yes.
And the way that I understand it, I mean, I don't know if I'm not going to get into a whole explanation on this, but I question, is Dugin, do you think, or do you have any knowledge of Dugin taking inspiration from Savitri Devi?
He does cite him in a couple of Russian articles, so he knows about her work and he knows her point of departure. Devi's main acolyte was a South American gentleman by the name of Miguel. I think it's Serrano. I'm not sure.
Miguel Serrano. Yeah.
So he kind of spread this esoteric Hitlerism in Spanish throughout South America, and that became kind of the discourse of choice amongst a lot of these right-wing, fascist forces and circles in South America, all the way until pretty much recently. She herself and her point of departure, this whole esoteric Hitlerism, segues into this left-hand path Satanism of groups like the Order of the Nine Angels, because they emerge initially as a kind of an esoteric National Socialist group in Britain, and then kind of morph into all kinds of things, and they create decentralized kind of cells everywhere throughout the West. And the danger of this particular group is in one thing, it believes that it wants to create what it calls an imperium, a imperium that even transcends the planet Earth. And this would be a kind of a white nationalist dystopia that would then basically eradicate all brown and non-white peoples from the planet, and then go out and conquer the space, as it were.
I wonder if that has anything to do with Robert Charroux. Because Robert Charroux is a guy who, I want to say he's the guy that's responsible for like the Nordic white hair or blonde hair, blue eye aliens kind of thing. And did a lot of science fiction writing around Hyperborea. Yeah. And, I mean, it's what a choice of a word, an imperium, wow. Holy shit.
There's a lot of people that are attracted to this stuff. You would be surprised. I mean, and in some very unlikely places too.
Yeah. It's just all so unsettling. And I think I've said this before, but like, what's so unsettling about all this stuff to me is that it's on just so many levels. It's so offensive. Like, if you're a thoughtful person that values ideas and philosophy and a history of ideas, well, then Dugin takes all of that information and turns it on itself, Yeah. If you're a person that is pro-democracy and pro-human rights and pro-egalitarian stuff, then he turns the universality of human rights and the tradition of liberalism on itself as well. And if you're a person of faith, then he totally bastardizes like the entire concept of having faith and being dedicated to like truth, goodness, and beauty in the world. So it's all this stuff. I feel like, Ukraine and what's happening, to come back to current events, it's like the beginning of his political program in so many ways.
But you know what? For all of that, we really have to be fair here. Like I mentioned, if Dugin didn't exist, or even if Putin didn't exist, they'd have to be created. This situation that the world now finds itself with Ukraine, which is an extremely dangerous situation that could lead us to nuclear war if we're not careful, could have been avoided. And it could have been avoided during the last year of the Soviet Union. It could have been avoided by consecutive American administrations. If they had honored the undertakings that they had made with Mikhail Gorbachev, if NATO had not been pushed to the borders of Russia, and more than that, if Ukraine had not been turned into this massive American military base as it has over the last decade, with American advisors and whatnot, and NATO and Western European, we wouldn't be here right now. I am no apologist for the Russian kleptocracy and its criminal oligarchic regime, but the policymakers and strategists of the West, in my opinion, from what I've seen, are not very smart people. That they either willingly or unwittingly are creating these situations that lead to these to what we're seeing today in Ukraine. And the innocent people on the ground, are then caught in the crossfire between these forces, that they don't need to be. And also the Russian people themselves, who are not happy about themselves being dragged into a war with their Ukrainian cousins. I mean, this is completely unnecessary. A lot of these people, up until the 1990s, were comrades under the Soviet state. Many of them served in the military with each other. I have friends in Ukraine. I have friends in Russia, and their parents and their families, were tight. And so what you're seeing with this, and this is why Putin doesn't make any sense to me in what he's doing, is because he's basically doing the same sort of thing that happened in the Balkans in the 90s when the Yugoslav state imploded suddenly. And you had these ethnic tensions and divisions and hatred that just suddenly came to the boil that hadn't existed for over 50 years, under that Yugoslav state, socialist state. And so the question that everyone needs to ask is, qui bono? Who benefits from this state of affairs? And the answer is always obvious. It is capital that benefits from this, whether it is the arms dealers and manufacturers on the Russian side, or the NATO and the American and the Western European side, because this racket that is war is their piggy bank. It is their cash cow. And the other day I was talking to a gentleman on the street, and he kind of basically threw this at me. He said that he looks at what's happening in Ukraine as kind of an attempt by industry to make up for the shortfalls that they lost during the COVID pandemic. Because it comes up, right at the tail end of it. Then so much money was lost and whatnot. This is the perfect opportunity for them to now make money from another angle. And he's right to some degree, because there is evidence to that end. But it is also dangerous. Many innocent people are getting killed. Potentially, there could be nuclear war that would lay this planet to waste, or at least large sections of it. Poison the atmosphere, poison the oceans, etc. We don't need to be here. And we don't need to be here, and we shouldn't be here. Had there been a third force on this planet that would adequately confront both of these, fascists and Atlanticists simultaneously, we wouldn't be here right now at all.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this show, man. Do you want to tell people where we can find you online? And by the way, just thank you so much for everything that you've told, for sounding the alarm on this, for having to travel to Australia to relocate, and and the memory of your wife as well.
Thank you.
My heart goes out to you. And we had said on the phone at one point when we spoke that we have to stick together, because this stuff is. I'm trying to sound the alarm on it. You're trying to sound the alarm on it, and I think this needs to be spoken about, and people need to be made aware of it. So. For whatever risks they may entail in doing so, I appreciate you having at least.
Can I make one last point?
Yeah.
People.
Of course,
people can take it or leave it. The Ukrainian war between Russia and Ukraine and the West is really a war of oligarchs, and so the Western left has to be extremely adept not to back one oligarch against another. We should advocate for people on the ground, people who are being brutalized on all sides, whether they're Russians or Ukrainians, whether they're Russian soldiers or proletariat. We should be advocating for them, because these people don't need to be in that theater, and not for plutocrats and oligarchs and their agendas, whether they're Western or Eastern. This is where we need to be, because if a sizable voice comes into being that is very clear and advocates for something like that, then all sides will notice, as it were, and maybe we can do something for these people. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I feel the same way. It's like the most cogent position to take out of all of this is to be anti-NATO, but not be completely blind to Russia's military incursion. And I don't know if it's like a default sort of inherited Cold War positioning that we all that not all of us, but like I'm certainly not. I'm like, shit, dude. I understand Russia's capitalist, and I'm not going to take the side of a capitalist in any war that's harming civilians on the ground. And I just think that, like, sometimes you just have to lead with your first principles and trust in those.
Exactly.
And I know that we're Marxists, we're not moralists, but I mean, there is a moral truth to this situation that really is like a guiding North Star. So yeah, as I do appreciate you even saying that, because unfortunately I'm not hearing a whole lot of that out there, man.
And more people need to speak that way, and maybe we will stop this war, if more people kind of understand the greater dynamics and not jump on bandwagons,
Right.
Or create a new one, as it were. Create a new bandwagon altogether rather than this one or the other one.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of No Easy Answers. As always, thank you for the support. Thank you for listening. And thanks for sharing these episodes on your social media. You know, right now we have lots of cool bonus content on this topic available on our Patreon. So for like $3 a month, you can unlock all of that right now at patreon.com/No Easy Answers. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Wahid's article, as well as Wahid's blog, Twitter, and YouTube channel. And we do have more content on this topic forthcoming, so keep an eye out for that. All right, so I'm going to get out of here. Take care, all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. See ya.